Good afternoon. Thank you to those of you who have joined. We will begin shortly at the top of the hour, so thank you for your patience and just hold on the line. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy New Year from us at Panjiva. My name is Hillary Rudd, and I'm an account manager here at Panjiva. I'm also going to be the moderator for today's call. Thank you for joining us for today's Panjiva discussion. We're very excited for today's talk, as we will be discussing our global trade outlook for 2018. For those of you who have not been able to join us for previous webinars, Panjiva Discussions is a monthly web series hosted by our data analyst, Chris Rogers, and is based on Panjiva research. The discussions typically feature guests from inside and outside of Panjiva and focus on various topics. Last year, we covered the India trade opportunity, China trade opportunities, and NAFTA. And all previous webinars are available on our support pages, or you also can request them by emailing support@panjiva.com. The topics of future discussions are chosen by us. However, we really encourage you to send us your suggestions for future webinars as well. So please send those suggestions to support@panjiva.com. For today's webinar, Chris will be joined by Panjiva CEO and co-founder Josh Green. Chris and Josh will offer their unique perspectives on the state of global trade and what we can expect this year. There will be time at the end of our discussion for a Q&A session. But please submit any questions as you think of them via the question box that launched when you opened the presentation. Before I begin, I do want to disclose that the discussion is being recorded, and the recording will be made available following our call, as well as a PDF of Panjiva's Global Trade Outlook for 2018. I'm going to turn it over now to Chris, who's going to give us some background for today's discussion. Chris?
Great, thanks very much, Hillary, and good afternoon to everybody who's dialed in today. Thank you for joining us. So no outlook for a year can really start without a review of the previous year. 2017 was really, probably the strongest year yet for global trade. As you may be able to see from the slide that's on the screen at the moment, it was the year the protectionist dog barked but didn't bite. Lots of concerns going into the year about actions, whether by the new administration of Donald Trump or reactions from other parts of the world, but those simply did not come to pass. And trade activity last year continued in a growth spurt that's really gone all the way back to 2009. And that gives us some cause for confidence going into 2018. Looking on the global stage, there's a lot of trade deals that are currently under negotiation that give us plenty of faith that 2018 and beyond will lead to further trade liberalisation at a very broad level, even though there will continue to be friction at the local level. There's currently several deals under negotiation across Asia. These include the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that's hubbed around the ASEAN and China. There's the TPP, or now the CPTPP. There's deals in America with NAFTA, but also more broadly across the Americas with both Canada and Mexico either having completed or negotiating deals with Europe. And then in turn, the Europeans are negotiating their own trade deals, whether it's with India, Mexico, Mercosur, the recently completed deal in Japan, and of course, a topic that's close to my own heart, Brexit. So plenty of trade deals being negotiated, but the most significant one is RCEP. By the way, part of the 60-page PDF report you'll receive includes an explanation of all of these acronyms, so you don't need to remember them. But RCEP really is going to provide a number of countries access to, or more access to the Chinese market, and forms a critical part of the Chinese government's broader economic policies, whether that's part of Belt and Road, Made in China 2025, or just the broader aim of the Chinese government to increase their influence, not just within the Asian region, but globally. With all that said, China's not really in a rush to get this deal done. Over the past 6 months, we've seen the government swing from being very much focused on exports to aiming to actually increase the level of imports that they're carrying out. And that's partly to support the growth of the domestic economy and avoid excessive inflation, which is very much at top of mind for the Chinese government when it's thinking about maintaining political peace and ensuring that consumer incomes, the incomes of the population at large, continue to improve. Currently, Chinese imports are very much focused on raw materials and components. The chart that we have here is from our shipment analytics package. What you can see from that is that semiconductors and other components represent the vast majority of imports to China at the moment. So they very much want to grow their consumer economy. The deal that's competing with RCEP is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the legacy left over after President Trump pulled the US out of TPP at the beginning of 2017. Now, unfortunately, CPTPP is competing with RCEP to a certain extent, and that's because there are a lot of joint members between the two, not least of which is Japan, which is the largest economy. But the CPTPP also includes Mexico and Canada, and that makes it a more complicated deal as well, because obviously they're also negotiating the NAFTA trade deal. And this patchwork quilt of trade deals that we're seeing, whilst encouraging for the future of the state of global trade, does mean it makes it more difficult to get deals up and running. The chart that you see here shows in orange the mix of exports from Mexico to other CPTPP countries and to Canada. And you can see from that that there's a very different mix of trade between the two. So what Mexico wants from Canada as part of TPP and what Mexico wants from Canada as part of NAFTA are very different things. And that's going to make it far from easy to close a deal. As if more complication wasn't needed, Canada's just signed a trade deal with Europe, and Mexico is in the process of trying to sign a deal as well. The chart we have up here shows that Mexico's exports at the moment to the European Union are actually focused on a number of small areas, particularly the auto industry and the energy industry, and they want to spread that out. At the same time, the European Union is trying to ensure its different trade deals are compatible, whether it's with Canada, Japan, South Korea, where there are talks happening next week. They want to very much focus on a single kind of template for these trade deals. Add on top of all of that, of course, Mexico has elections coming up in July of this year, and that's going to very much dominate the political agenda in that country, particularly once we get past March. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room, as it were, that I haven't talked about so far is US trade policy, and I think that is very much driven by politics. I want to bring kind of Josh in here, just talk a little bit about where you see kind of the politics of trade, not just right now, but how we've kind of ended up where we are right now.
Right. Happy to talk about that, and also want to thank Hillary and Chris for having me, and for all of you today for joining. You know, the politics of trade are fascinating. You know, in a big picture sense, I think the arguments for and against trade have changed over time. You know, you go back all the way to the days of the Cold War. Trade was really framed as a national security issue, a way of strengthening alliances between partners. And as you go back to the 90s, the politics of trade, or the discussion about trade, was really much more economics focused, right? Trade is an engine of economic growth, of development around the world. It was around this time that I think we started to see some real pushback against trade, which you didn't see when it was framed as a national security issue. I think as you look at the last 12, 24 months, not just in the US, but globally, I think one of the defining aspects of what's happened is that those forces that were speaking out against trade have really been ascended politically. And they've really taken control of the conversation. Again, I think it's important to note that's not just in the U.S., right? That Brexit is part of that story, and the elections in the U.S. are just one part of that story. If you look at the conversations that are in flight today, Chris, you mentioned a bunch of different deals that are in play. The thing I would point out is it's not just that there are a lot of different deals in play, there are a lot of different types of deals that are in play, and a lot of fundamentally different approaches to trade. And if you look back over the last decade or so, the dominant themes or the dominant approaches to trade were really around global rules or regional pacts. And now I think you're seeing global rules being less dominant, less of a focus on these big global deals. And you see all these regional deals that you're describing, as well as the focus on bilateral deals. And I think it makes for a really interesting moment for trade policy, because I think there are two very different questions that are on the table, and the answers are really up for grabs. The choices, I should say, are really up for grabs. Choice one is trade something that we are moving forward with, that we are investing in, that we think is an engine for growth or not? Is it something that we need to protect ourselves against and make sure is not doing damage, right? Those are two very different directions you can go in. And then the second choice is around what flavor of trade and trade policy do we want for the next decade, the next century? Is it a patchwork of bilateral deals, a patchwork of regional deals, or a more global approach? And it's totally unclear how these things are going to play out. That makes it very interesting, but also challenging from a business perspective to think about how to manage your business.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, I think one of the big political issues that's emerged from the choice that maybe the American population have made or certainly voters have made, was to follow a more unilateral approach being advocated by President Trump. I think one of the areas that's kind of interesting for me right now is just the breadth of actions that the president's taken. So we published a report today that synthesized, and I counted up 488 reports that we've published on the trade impacts of the Trump administration since January 20th last year. But he's been good to his word, which is, I will do something about trade. I will meet these concerns, as part of the overweening aim of making America great again. For whatever you think of that as a slogan, there's been at least 26 major trade actions that the administration have taken. I can talk a little bit in a minute about kind of how those might be delivered upon. But clearly, the administration ended last year on something of a high. I guess my question to you, Josh, is do you think they're going to try and capitalize on that going into this year, or through midterm elections coming up, give the American population an opportunity to decide whether they still want MAGA as their kind of guiding light, or whether they want something slightly different? So I don't know what your thoughts are around that.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think the thing that is, from my perspective, fact not even a matter of opinion, but trade was a winning issue for President Trump during the campaign, and his approach is really resonated with a lot of folks, specifically on the subject of trade. And as you look back over the last year of the Trump administration, I think a lot of things have happened in a lot of different areas. And as you rightly pointed out, there's been a lot of stuff happening in the realm of trade. But I don't think that trade has been at the top of the political conversation this year in the same way that it was during the campaign last year. And as we head into 2018, I think that the facts on the ground that matter are that there's a midterm election coming up. And I think President Trump knows that trade is a winning issue. And so my expectation is that you're going to see trade rise to the top of the political discussion again by design. And I think that is, that's going to be in the news. It's going to be in the headlines. I think the question of what's the real on the ground economic impact, that's a harder question to answer. But will trade be a dominant part of the political conversation in 2018? I think absolutely, more so than it was in 2017. It'll look more like it did during the campaign of 2016.
Yeah, and I think the notable thing, one of the issues coming out of that big review that we did was effectively there are already a number of areas that are kind of shovel ready if you want to talk infrastructure, trigger ready if you're taking more of a defense outlook of actions that the president can actually take. One is these Section 201 reviews, so the safeguarding reviews asked for by Whirlpool and by Suniva to protect the washing machine industry and the solar panel industry. Those have taken a long time to deliver. And certainly the chart I have up at the moment shows, imports of washing machines, affect, microeconomic as that might be, hit an all-time high in December, because you've got overseas parties reacting to a policy that hasn't yet been acted on. So there is kind of definitely a kind of a time value to actions that haven't yet been taken. Section 232 reviews of the steel and aluminum industries have been awaited for quite a long time. Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, committed to having a report in the hands of the President in June of last year, and it actually was put into the President's hands about 2 weeks ago. So, those things have taken a very long time, but I do get a sense that, certainly going into the State of the Union, there are, a handful of things that could be done very much to maintain momentum for the administration. However, I think when it comes down to, actually making an economic difference, rather than necessarily kind of generating positive news flow, easy deliverables ahead of the midterms, it's the trade deals where the president's going to have to ensure that his administration gets some real tangible outcomes. One example is NAFTA. We talked about that on the previous webinar, so I won't bore our listeners with our current views, other than to say that I'm very concerned that the president will lose patience if the round of talks that begins next week don't get anywhere, and could well issue a withdrawal notice, which Mexico has said would lead them to withdraw from the talks as well. So we're right on the cusp of a big risk there. But elsewhere, I think the Korea trade deal, the South Korean trade deal, is fascinating because effectively the trade deficit with South Korea, like the trade deficit with the NAFTA region, is based around the autos industry. Effectively, in the case of NAFTA, that's 70% of the trade deficit. In the case of Korea, it's 80% of the trade deficit in that one industry. And so, the auto industry, I would say, has probably got the riskiest supply chain of any that's out there at the moment. I think the challenge is for the administration to find ways to encourage exports rather than just blocking imports. Blocking imports is, in absolute terms, a bad thing for the economy. It will lead to higher inflation, cutting consumer incomes in America. It will lead to a loss of jobs overseas, having a net negative effect on the global economy more broadly. And importantly, it doesn't necessarily bring back jobs. Samsung who are setting up a washing machine factory in the US in response to the trade case that's going through, has said it will be mostly automated. It's difficult to see more than 200 jobs being brought in. It might save Wilson's bacon temporarily, but it doesn't necessarily have the big impact on jobs that was helped. The big issue, though, for me is action with China. The Section 301 review, which is a review of Chinese intellectual property practices, could give the president quite significant leeway to implement tariffs against China, potentially leading to a deterioration in relationships there. The chart that I've got up at the moment is a mix of Chinese exports to the US, and one thing that comes out of that is it's mostly consumer goods. So actually, if the president wants to put tariffs in place, he's going to end up hitting iPhones, computers, furniture, indirectly car parts, which will have an impact on General Motors and Ford and so on. So that may need to have a go-on tariffs against industrial materials, base metals, so steel and aluminum I've already mentioned, but I think plastic is a potential area for action as well. So, there's all of these things available that the president can already implement if he chooses to, but, the targeting has to be very, very careful. The one issue that raises for me, having mentioned the auto supply chain, is that it's not just consumers that have got skin in the game here, it's corporations as well. I know one thing, Josh, you talked about in the past is, getting on with business as usual. Do you think that's still something that, is that still good advice for this year, or should people be hanging back on investments, and just wait and see what happens?
I do think at the beginning of 2017, particularly if you were involved in the world of trade, it was a bit of a deer in headlights moment, because the political winds had certainly changed, and it was totally unclear what was going to happen, and it's tough to manage a business with uncertainty as the key fact on the ground. It's my second time saying facts on the ground. Need a new phrase. But interestingly enough, despite all that uncertainty, as you noted, trade was quite healthy last year, and business had to get done. I do think, broadly speaking, 2018 is going to be a year where people say, okay, we understand that the political wind shifted and things are still in flight, in flux, but it's not as if trade is going to come to a halt. It's not as if there's going to be some truly radical restructuring of the rules of the road, and therefore it's time to make investment decisions. And those decisions will be made. And I think politics will be an input, but it won't be the dominant input.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think, you mentioned kind of uncertainty there. One of the elements that we put into our outlook this year for the first time is a review of what's often referred to as black swan risks, low probability, high impact. I was talking with a customer who read the report and said, well, they feel more like grey swans than black swans, because they all feel a little bit more possible than we necessarily like. I think the big one for me is the risk of conflict. Clearly that's never good for the economy unless you're in the defence business. But I think particularly conflict in the South China Sea could have a significant impact on global trade. Just mechanistically, you think about how much trade occurs between China and the US, but also the kind of greater China, that's the wrong phrase to use, the supply chain that surrounds China in that region with all the countries that border the South China Sea. China's become a lot more assertive in its belief in the 9-dash line, effectively saying the whole of the South China Sea is ours. They've, in the past year, been creating military landing strips on these little atolls across the region. I am a little concerned that wars never happen deliberately, they happen by accident. And it's too easy in a world where political tensions are already high for something to go wrong. And I think conflict in the South China Sea is a big risk. The chart I have up at the moment just shows for the countries that are surrounded by the 9-dash line what their main product exports are. And I would encourage our customers to get the advertorial out of the way, use the Panjiva platform to think through where their potential supply chain risks might be, not just for themselves, but for their customers as well, that so-called second round effect. The other related issue to that is disruption of trade flows potentially in the NAFTA region. And I'm not worried about NAFTA being cancelled per se, I'm worried about the combination of a failure of NAFTA and a tightening of borders. I'm sure we're not going to see a concrete wall being built this year, but tightened immigration standards mean heavier-handed customs. Suddenly everything has to be inspected instead of flowing through. And I would definitely be concerned about the impact for our customers and their supply chains coming from that. Another risk that's kind of for our listeners, I'm kind of a half glass empty guy, and Josh is a half glass as well. Actually, a glass full, completely full guy. But the promise of automation of ports could really improve trade flows, could improve efficiency, but getting there could be incredibly painful. We've seen in the past year in Gothenburg and in Spain, as two examples we saw in 2015 in Los Angeles, the impact of strikes. And there's already been a failure in pay talks on the East Coast between the port owners and the unions to agree the transition to automation, which effectively involves lower employment, which again that's been a theme of expanding global trade. But if we see the kind of port strikes in the East Coast that we saw on the West Coast, that could be massively disruptive. Clearly, the secret, as we do comedy, is timing. In the case of the West Coast strikes, they happened in January, when there was very little trade going on. If I was part of the ILWU, the Longshoremen's Union, I'd be thinking about disruption in September or October. That would really hit the time where you would have the most leverage. So again, I'd urge our customers to be thinking about how they can kind of mitigate that risk. I'm aware we're kind of coming up on time. I've talked a little bit about technology. Josh, I don't know if you have thoughts on where you see some technology innovations coming in the supply chain industry that you're maybe excited about for the next couple of years.
I think there's the self-serving argument that data is a tool that people are increasly embracing, and I do believe that to be true. I think about the arc of conversations that we've had over the years, from the very earliest days of Panjiva, where I think most of the folks that we talked to were actually pretty resistant to using data as part of their decision-making process. Very different dynamic now. And I think that's good. But I think data, and I'll shift away from the Panjiva-centric discussion, I think data is the use of data is reaching a point of maturity where it's not just a novelty, it's not just something that's interesting, it's something that people are expecting to get real results from. And I think that's appropriate. And I think, if you look across the world of logistics and supply chain, I think there are a lot of different areas of technology where that's true, where people say, we bought into the idea of process automation, of global trade management, software solutions. We need to really see that these are delivering results. And if they don't, I think it's going to make people skittish about the next generation of investments in technology. The big one that everybody's talking about, of course, these days is blockchain. And while I don't think Bitcoin is yet a key driver of global trade, I do think the underlying technology of blockchain, everybody's discussing what are the actual uses of blockchain technology, and interestingly, global trade could be one of those. And there was the recently announced deal with IBM and Maersk, I believe it was, looking closely at this. I do think that one's not at maturity yet, right? That's one that is still, there's excitement and there's energy, and I think investment around that excitement and energy, and the demand for a payoff, it's not there yet. It'll be, several years out. But those are things that I'm keeping tabs on, because I think it's all pretty exciting in terms of things that could have an impact on just a massive, massive economic activity, the one that we're all working in.
That's great. And I think on that note, we did, as part of the review, take a look at the state of blockchain for the logistics industry, and we're going to make that part of one of our future webinars, along with a review of kind of the state of the logistics industry more broadly, where we've seen kind of a year of consolidation. I think there's a lot more to come as the industry becomes more profitable. Now, we've taken 28 minutes to talk about what we want to talk about. Hilary, I think, have we got any questions we can maybe hit on those?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. As Chris just mentioned, please submit any questions that you have through the question box that launched when you joined the presentation, and we'll answer as many as time allows. Chris, just a question for you as we start to receive other questions. We talked about India in a previous webinar a couple of months ago. Are you still optimistic about India trade opportunities, and if not, where else are you optimistic?
Okay. Yeah, I think with, I mean, the promise for me in India is effectively, you know, a well-educated workforce that wants better for itself. And, you know, that will, over the very long term, kind of, you know, overcome bureaucratic hurdles. You know, the big difference between China and India in many regards is the political system. Ironically, you know, the Indian system of democracy arguably has held back trade development because you don't have what amounts to in China a command economy. That's led, there's a lot of things wrong with the way business is done in India, as there are in many, many countries. But I think the government's involvement has not necessarily helped from a bureaucracy perspective. And I have been disappointed really over the past couple of months to see quite a high degree of new import tariffs being implemented by the government to try and encourage the development of domestic business. And that's been another big difference between, I think, India and China, is that China followed very much an export-led economy. India is trying to, you know, grow its own domestic manufacturing industry, but because it is somewhat late to the party in terms of economic, technological development in manufacturing, it's put in tariffs on consumer goods. We're seeing potential for a lot more tariffs in raw materials as well. That may well work out, but it does make life a lot more complicated. I think where there is potential for development are in some of the lower labour cost Southeast Asian countries. We've already seen quite significant growth, for example, from Vietnam. I think the challenge there is that the developed economies now, either in the case of Europe, want trade deals, and, you know, it's difficult to negotiate with a much bigger partner and get a great deal, or you're dealing with America, which is taking much more of a kind of a unilateral approach, but also, you know, we want to see a bilateral deal. I think where there may be some kind of under-recognised potential possibly is in Latin America. We've seen a lot of Latin American countries took a big swing towards populism and socialism. I think a lot of the Latin American population has seen what's happened in Venezuela and said, actually, that's not necessarily the best way to be running an economy. And we're beginning to see a re-emergence, I think, of, you know, a more, I wouldn't say capitalist approach, but, you know, certainly more of a approach of focusing on developing the economy rather than just working on purely populist terms. And the fact that Mercosur are close to a trade deal with the EU, the fact, frankly, that Mercosur kicked Venezuela out and not following the rules, I think is phenomenally encouraging. Again, without being too self-serving, there is a lot of data available on the Panjiva platform to analyse that, and I do get a sense a lot of our customers haven't yet recognised the full opportunities for them in that market.
Great. You touched briefly on NAFTA during your discussion, but we do have a question on where you see negotiations in the next 6 to 12 months. Is there an industry that is key for the renegotiation to be passed?
Yeah. Yeah, I think as we mentioned a bit earlier on, it's kind of all about autos. You know, it is 70% of the tariff, the tariff deficit, the trade deficit. You know, one of the big winners from NAFTA when it was originally implemented was the auto industry and the ability for the automakers, not just American ones, but those from elsewhere in the world to, you know, take advantage of a larger market and, you know, really optimize their supply chains within that. I am concerned that the President Trump will withdraw. I'm also concerned that the Mexican elections will provide something of a hiatus to the proceedings. There's lots of game theory around, would President Trump effectively withdraw or give a notice to withdraw in March, that he could then withdraw 6 months later, having brought Mexico and Canada back to the table to show an easy win ahead of the midterm elections. That's all possible. I think ultimately, the president is a businessman. He's been listening a lot recently to businesses, not just from America, but also from the partner countries as well. And ultimately, I think once he recognises the job-creating potential of a reformed NAFTA, that will ultimately get some sort of deal done in some sort of time. Is it going to get done by March? No. I can't see it. Are we going to be sat here this time next year with someone asking the question, how do you see NAFTA negotiations in the next 6 to 12 months? I think the answer may sadly be yes. I don't know, Josh, if you've got any.
Well, one thing I'd pick up on, I do think the Farm Belt is an important part of the NAFTA story, and I think you've seen recently agriculture interests being more assertive and making the case for NAFTA because it facilitates growth in their business via exports. And I think that is that's a storyline to follow closely, because it will potentially is going to put political pressure on folks that are in the Republican Party and will therefore have more influence over President Trump. Folks that are in Congress, the Senate, that represent districts or states where those exports are really critical to the economy.
Yeah, and I think it's notable as well that the American farming community, if you look at the data, has had a phenomenal couple of years. It's been helped by harvests. It's been helped actually by presidential actions already. The big swing through Asia in November, there were a lot of new deals signed for soybeans, for beef, and so on. Unfortunately, I think as well, agriculture, farmers, ranchers, are often also held hostage in trade relations. We've just seen China agreed to buy more American produce, and then has come back very recently and said, oh, by the way, we're tightening up some of the labeling requirements, some of the certification requirements, excuse me, which is very much of a, I think a little bit of a rattling of the saber to say, hey, we're a big market, we said we'd buy more, but we don't have to. And then you just face the, excuse the pun, common or garden risks that farming faces from year to year. Wheat planting for winter wheat, which we wrote about just last week, will be the lowest in a century this year. And one of the reasons for that is reduced access to export markets, because there's been a resurgence of production in Russia, and that's satisfying requirements around Europe and Asia. So yeah, one of the first things I learned coming to trade was just how important agriculture is within that. And yeah, your point's well taken about that, the importance of that within NAFTA.
So in line with the NAFTA discussion, if the negotiations do not go through, what do you see happening to the U.S. market, and are there developing countries who could potentially, that would open up opportunities for them?
Do you want to take the macro point first, Josh, or do you want to?
I think this one's so hard for me because I'm a glass totally full kind of guy. I have a hard time believing that the negotiations will just fall apart and the countries will choose to go their own separate way. So I think there will be a lot of brinksmanship. I think there may be some changes that result from that brinksmanship. I have such a hard time contemplating that actually happening that I don't think I have a particularly good answer as to what comes next. To the extent that it, to the question of, where does it create opportunities? I think that's one where I also struggle, because I think if the U.S. does walk away from an agreement that is so central like NAFTA, the question becomes, who then is going to be interested in negotiating a deal with the United States? And maybe there are some smaller countries that'll say, hey, it's an opportunity, let's go for it. But I do think there will be some trepidation because now we will have proven ourselves to be a country that can change course pretty dramatically even after a relationship is negotiated. So I don't think it's a great answer to your question, but it's the honest one.
I think a couple of things I'd add to that. I think on trade negotiations, I think one of the interesting things that the NAFTA talks and also the Chorus talks have brought through is a recognition that trade deals can't be once and forever. Mm. You know, things change. Right. Like the automotive rules of origin in NAFTA were set up in the 80s. Right. Yeah, there's no concept of self-driving vehicles, electric cars, hybrid powertrains. You know, that has to be, you have to have those kind of reopeners. Clearly, the NAFTA negotiations are a little bit more than a reopener. The Chorus negotiations are a reopener. This is kind of more fundamental than that. I think to the question as to which countries may win, I actually think this will go could go a number of ways, but I think there's two things to think about, and it very much split down by industry. One is effectively Mexico loses because within NAFTA, it's kind of the lower labor cost region. You know, it's very much stereotypical, and it's certainly less the case now than it was when NAFTA got started. But you've got to think if you're a manufacturer, you lose NAFTA, well, actually, you know what, I might as well produce wherever labor is cheapest. I'm going to look at Vietnam, I'm going to look at Cambodia, I'm going to look at Bangladesh. I'm going to set up in those countries instead because, ultimately, if I'm only paying $700 a TEU for international shipping and I'm producing anything that's not really, really big, then actually I'll go where the labor's cheapest. The other alternative, and again, it depends on the industry, is to say, actually, okay, you've made my life more complex. I'm going to set up in the US with robots. And, that's happening anyway. But, as has been the case, as we've seen with Samsung's and LG's home appliances factories, if you were starting any new factory today, it would have more automation than it does, many years ago. And, to a certain extent, American workers today are competing with robots as much as they are with the maquiladoras in Mexico, or with workers in Bangladesh or wherever. So I think arguably one of the winners from a failure of NAFTA could be industrial robot manufacturers like Fanuc or Kawasaki Heavy. Ironically, those robots aren't made in the US; they're made in in more developed economies like Japan, like South Korea, and so on. So that could almost, again, it involves a retooling of supply chains. It makes everybody's lives more complicated. It certainly doesn't necessarily mean that US employment improves. And ultimately, I think a big part of, to come back to your point earlier, Josh, a big part of the reason that trade wasn't a big issue from a political perspective last year was there was a focus on healthcare, but also jobs. And a big part of tax reform, whilst it was pitched as being initially we're going to put more money in middle class income pockets, actually it was all about setting business free to invest, giving them more money to invest, cutting regulations, whatever you think of that, it's very much focused around jobs. The jobs promise of trade protectionism, difficult to see that actually working, I think, the way that people that advocate that kind of strategy necessarily would hope it would.
Right. Difficulty in seeing it work from a policy perspective, but from a political perspective, it's a proven winner. Right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, it's why I'm kind of fascinated by the midterms coming up because, and Josh and I discussed before in private, but just to kind of put the views out there a little bit, should we see the Democrats take one or both houses at the midterms, there's a question raised as to whether the president says, actually, I still want to get stuff done. I am, a Republican in name, but I will work with whoever I need to work with. Do you think there's a possibility that we'd see almost kind of a centrist president kind of after the midterm just to get the job done?
Yeah, so I do. I think, to me, the parallel is to Clinton in '94, after the Republican wave, just in his own self-interest to position himself for re-election. He had to get stuff done. He worked with Republicans. I think President Trump would likely do the same thing if there's a Democratic wave in the midterm elections. And I think the areas that I think are ripe, infrastructure is a big one. That was one that right after the election 2016, when Democrats were looking for something to say they could work with President Trump on, they all went to infrastructure. And President Trump has made clear that that's something he's very interested in. So I think that's one area, and trade actually is another. I think there's, trade is an interesting one in that you see protectionism and free traders in both parties. And in some respects, President Trump's positions on trade more closely align with the historical Democratic positions on trade. So that may be an area where you see them coming together around, a tougher stance on trade post midterms. We'll see.
Interesting.
Probably have time for one more question. Might be a little too early to answer this one, but have you seen any decrease in shipments from GSP countries since the beginning of the month when GSP expired?
Yeah, I think so just to explain for yet another trade acronym, the General System of Preferences is basically designed to help economic development in developing economies by offering lower tariffs to imports from those countries. The short answer is, so there's two answers. One is it's very, very early. We've only got 2 weeks worth of data. But certainly at first blush, there hasn't been a significant change. And I think that's partly just due to how short the time series is. I think it's also a reflection of the fact that the economy is doing pretty well, right? So whether it costs you an extra 10% or 20% to buy, if you're an American retailer buying, let's say, apparel from a developing economy, you'll be able to pass those higher costs through, through higher inflation, even if you don't want to take, if you don't want to take the hit to your profitability in the short term. For me, actually, the bigger issue than GSP is MTB. So the miscellaneous tariff bill, which passed the House earlier this week, kind of works the other way up, and it basically says if there are products on which there are tariffs that are important to American manufacturers, then, and that's very much, that bill covers just over 1,700 tariff lines, then there'll be reduced tariffs for that. So yes, the American manufacturer of the components might suffer, but it's for the greater good of the broader American manufacturing community. If MTB, which is kind of in limbo at the moment, if that isn't renewed, then that would have a seriously detrimental impact on trade. There isn't a single industry that's travel negative in that isn't impacted by that. All industries have got some sort of exposure. Complex manufacturing is more exposed than elsewhere. Chemicals are quite a big part of the MTB as well. But I think that very much both MTB and GSP need to get sorted out. I'm confident on MTB. Effectively, there's very strong American business lobbying for it. It helps business activity. I think the Senate will pass it. I think the President will probably sign it. GSP, I'm less sure. Some of the countries that are part of GSP are ones that the President has taken a tough stance towards. India is one of the countries in there, for example. So, there is a chance that even if it's passed by the House and the Senate, that the President might say, actually, here's another tangible way I can be tough on trade. We are not going to give these countries, and I won't use a phrase that's been attached to some of those countries recently by the President, I'm not going to give them a leg up. They're going to have to come to us for a trade deal. And that would be disruptive, and that would have an impact on trade. And certainly that's something that, in our month-to-month research, looking at trade flows is something that we would keep track of.
Great. Well, we have gone slightly over on time, but if either of you have any closing thoughts or remarks.
I'll give my optimistic take. I think, there is a year ago, I think we were looking ahead and looking at the political situation and wondering what impact it would have on trade. And I think in a collision between politics and economics won, and the economy did well, and trade did well. And I'm optimistic, as I always am, but I'm optimistic that this year, same story. Though trade will be back in the headlines politically, I think the underlying economics of trade, I think, remain healthy. So I'm optimistic for the year ahead.
Yeah, I think ultimately I am kind of optimistic about trade activity, because although I'm pessimistic about some of the outcomes we're going to get at a policy perspective, those things don't have an impact overnight. Even a withdrawal from NAFTA, it's not immediately clear that the president can actually have a direct impact on American trade law as a result, because any changes in trade law have to be passed by the House and Senate. So they could hold that up. So we could again be sat here this time next year with NAFTA negotiations ongoing or it not being implemented. So I think this year, from an activity perspective, is possibly secure, even though the mood music might be more challenging. And speaking as an analyst of global trade, it's bound to be a good year just because. So it's all right.
Yeah, well, thank you, Josh and Chris, for offering your unique perspectives. Thank you again to everyone who joined our call today. As I mentioned briefly at the beginning of the discussion, we have recorded it. So if you have any colleagues or other individuals you think might be interested, please feel free to send it along to them. Chris will also be sending the link to the discussion via the Panjiva Daily next week, so be on the lookout for that. Looking ahead, as Chris mentioned, we will be covering our outlook on technology and logistics in next month's Panjiva discussion. But again, if you have any topics of interest that you would like us to cover, please send those suggestions to support@panjiva.com. Thank you again to everyone who joined, and we hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.